two different things. One, which is IP geolocation. IP geolocation essentially is a database that contains a whole bunch of IP addresses and locations. And the other thing we'll talk about is what your browser exposes. I'm not sure why I didn't add the S there. Exposes when you connect when you browse to a web page. So IP geolocation is basically just a name for talking about some way of going from an IP address to a physical location. There are companies and open source utilities that provide this type of information. The cool thing about IP geolocation is that you can download it generally from a provider, so you don't have to be online to actually perform the lookup. That allows you some offsite type things a lot easier, so you aren't really notifying who you're trying to identify that you're interested in them. Generally speaking, the IP geolocation sources provide other attributes as well as location information. Generally, that's because the way that they figured out the location also means that they have other secondary attributes which they include with IP geolocation information. You generally find more secondary attributes with commercial providers than you do with the open source ones. So what does it mean? Given an IP address, you can tell approximately where someone is, which is generally speaking pretty good. I would say pretty good, that means reasonably accurate, doesn't mean accurate. You can use it to send targeted internet ads, which a lot of companies do. When you go to Google, they generally say, hey, you Arlington, Virginia user, are you interested in these companies? Which is specified, and it's okay. Generally, the other reason why they do it is because when you go to the BBC, they want to make sure you're in England and you're not in the US or another country where they don't have a license to show you that program. It is too bad because I really do like spooks, but I think that's not my point. It's a cool BBC show. Because of some non-disclosure type stuff, I'm going to talk about the open source techniques for creating this information. But we'll talk about the companies that provide this in a minute too. One way to do this is to ask the user. Hostip.info basically says, where are you? And it then prompts you to enter your location. And that's a reasonably good way of getting for an IP address where someone actually is. You also say if you're a network provider, give us your location information as well. If people are willing to do that, that's not a bad way of getting location information. And for my home IP address, it's correctly identified that I am somewhere in the United States. Another way to do it is to query registries. So software77.net, which is a South African Christian internet provider. They basically, in addition to providing that web service, they basically collect a bunch of whois information, and they provide basically a mapping for whois locations to an IP range. So if you have an IP address, you can get basically what whois would say what the country they're located in. And that's provided by the right registry information database. That's provided by the whois registry information databases. Basically, when you register for an IP address range, you have to provide whois information. And No one ever lies on that information, so it's obviously very reliable. That was tongue-in-cheek, because a lot of people lie when they do that registry, but it's one way of getting the approximate location of an IP address. Yes. Hostip.info.
Okay.
And it returns, in this case, because we're coming from MITRE and someone provided that information, it says we're coming from Bedford.
Okay.
For software77.net, you then go to somewhere here, IP to country. You then have,
See in the upper right corner?
yes. Yeah, and up here you can enter your IP address and it'll tell you basically the registrar, for the numeric IP address range, it'll tell you who the register is and also the country code associated with that. That particular IP address is Worcester Polytech, where I went to college. From here. Another way to do it is to use traceroute regular expressions. This is discussed. Oh, why isn't it showing up? Okay. In the documents folder, I actually have a document that explains it. There was a I don't recall off the top of my head, but there's a document in there which actually has points you to particular academic paper that describes how to do it. This is also, hostip.info has a forum area that discusses how they're doing traceroute regular expressions to do it as well. But basically, if you traceroute an IP address from a remote host, you go from MITRE to quest.net. At quest.net, you have renting out of DCA, which is Reagan Airport. You then go to EWR, which is in New Jersey. You then go to Quest in Boston, and then from Boston it goes directly to the IP address. So that means that Worcester, Mass is approximately close to Boston, which is correct. So that's another way of doing IP geolocation. That's one of the techniques that providers use to do that type of information. Any questions right now?
I have one.
Yes.
So I have used Google Maps with the Wi-Fi walking around campus, and it's updated my position pretty accurately.
That's a different technique, which we'll get to in a minute.
Figured it could be.
They're cheating. So this is a list of the open sources that provide IP geolocation. MaxMind is a commercial company in Boston, or it used to be in Boston. They're close to Boston at this point. I think they actually moved out of the proper city. And they offer open source versions of IP geolocation as well as paid versions of IP geolocation. There's a couple of minor differences, but basically the paid versions gives you a lot more additional attributes for a particular IP address range. They also provide history going back to 2003-ish or so, if you ask them, for the files that they produced over time. So if you care about where an IP address was at a certain date range, that's one way of providing that information. Hostip.info was the first one we discussed, and software77.net was the second one. The software77.net also provides the birth date for the IP address, so you sort of know the first time that that IP address was actually registered to a location, so that might be interesting as well. So the differences between the open source sources and the commercial sources is that basically the open sources just have the location information or maybe one or two other attributes. On the plus side, you are using known algorithms, so you know how they got that information as compared to some of the commercial sources where they basically aren't sharing that information with you. They just give you the location and the other attributes, which may or may not be useful. The other thing is that commercial sources, which can be very expensive, they claim higher accuracy. The issue is that it's hard to verify that accuracy without ground truth, and ground truth is unfortunately very hard to actually do for this space, so that's a known issue, unfortunately. The plus side with the open sources is that they're free. So if you need to do this occasionally, or if you need to do that sort of a secondary technique to your overall mission, which is what I do on my site, it's good to have the open sources. If you need to do something that is where you really care about the accuracy, you would probably want to go with the more commercial sources, given all the caveats that I'm going to present to you in the next slide. Now, here's the huge caveats with IP geolocation chart. You can only get to the most visible IP address. Time frame is a huge issue as well. Generally, data is delayed at least 1 month plus time to generate the database. So there's always going to be some lag time inherent with any IP geolocation solution for location information. There is a 1% to 2% change per month as well. So that's, given the large number of IP addresses on the internet, they are changing slowly over time as well. Domain name resolution is limited. Basically, they try to look at, for an IP address, what's the domain name associated with that, and that would generally be an AOL.com, MITRE.org. But they will only get you to the AOL.com or the MITRE.org, not the www.mitre.org. Netted IP addresses might also be an issue. Basically, if a user is using a broadband connection, they'll have they'll be using their own IP address range behind that router. So you could have someone SSH'd into that network, and then you'd be coming out of that location instead of where you actually are. So that's basically the ways that you can cheat IP geolocation. I'll be talking about more in a little bit as well. But so far, so good with the caveats. Okay, cool. So the next part is IP version 6 is slowly being integrated. It's more prevalent in Japan and other Asian countries as it is in the US right now. But that's also a known issue for IP geolocation. Basically, the service providers are providing betas of IP version 6 geolocation. So if you come across an IP version 6 IP address, it's generally being routed through an IP version 4 firewall right now. If you do actually have IP version 6 IP addresses in your logs, then you have to basically go to a whole separate file that will probably be out of date for that. but it's generally speaking, it's only in those Asian countries that you'll see IP version 6 IP address being used right now. And unfortunately, we do not have a piece of wood I can knock on right now. But that's sort of where IP version 6 is with IP geolocation right now. It's sort of like it's a known issue and they're trying to look at it. So when you use IP geolocation, you'll get this type of information back. MaxMind gives me the location, Arlington, Virginia, yay. I'm using Verizon. In the past, it's located me to Alexandria, Virginia, or to other locations such as, I think the farthest that got me away at one point was out to Ruston. That was generally because what happened was there was a major storm like Snowmageddon or the Drenko that went by, and all of Verizon's infrastructure was knocked down, and they assigned me a new IP address, and it took a while for the IP geolocation databases to catch up to the correct locations. They're generally accurate for the country. They're less accurate for the city level, but it's one of those things where, as a secondary indicator of where someone is, it's reasonably good. So this is the caveat of this is if you're looking at latitude and longitude information, you have to be sort of careful with it, because even though they'll provide the latitude and longitude to a very specified degree, you have to be careful with actually doing anything with that information, because this is a IP address which a lot of people are wondering, why is this particular farm in the center of the U.S. Have so much activity associated with it? Well, it's because it's in the center of the U.S. and they weren't able to derive better location information. So they just said, hey, it's somewhere in the United States, we're not sure where. So that's the reason why this location is so specific. It just happens to be the center of the country. And you'll see that particularly in other countries as well, where they just give the location information, the lat long information in the center of the country. Probably you just have to be careful with interpreting these results sometimes.